So, our final talk, I teased at the beginning, it's called Painting on the Moon. There's going to be kind of like a really cool surprise, because you think, painting on the moon, what is he talking about? It's ambitious, well, I'll give him that. What he is actually doing with his life, he's an artist, he's an educator, he's serious, and I'm super excited to hear what he has to say. Let's give a warm round of applause to Michael Markowsky.
Okay. How are you guys doing tonight? Maybe I'll take this off here and just move this to the side. Okay. Have you ever had a dream that is larger than you? And when I think about that, it's not just a dream that, like going to the Olympics and winning a gold medal, but doing something like inventing the Olympics. Something that doesn't already exist before, and you're trying to make that happen. Okay, we'll come back. So that's my next question. Is that dream inside of you right now? Because I have had a dream like that for many years, and for a long time, this was a ridiculous dream. And just over the past couple of months, that dream has become not inevitable for me necessarily, but inevitable for at least a number of other people. So I'll tell you a little bit about my story and how I got my dream. So when I was a little kid, I loved to draw. And I also was really into fighter planes and space. And my dad used to take me to air shows all the time where we go look at all the fighter planes and watch them flying really fast, meet the pilots. And when we were in Florida, we went down to Cape Canaveral. This is also around the same time as Space Camp, the movie, if you remember that. And if you see here, well, you can't really see, but I'm wearing a Pirates of the Caribbean t-shirt, because right before this, we had gone to Disney World. And I've always been really interested in this quote, this kind of cliched quote about, if you can dream it, you can do it. And I think it was really interesting looking back. I actually just found those photos of Cape Canaveral the other day, thinking about, oh, that's interesting, those things happened back to back. So when I grew older, I went to art school. This is at Cooper Union in New York. And my original idea was I wanted to be a car designer. But when I took a sculpture class, a teacher showed us this video of these guys who built this crazy car, and they drove it through a wall of flaming televisions. And I was like, wow, that can be art? Like, it didn't really occur to me that art was like this. So then I kind of went on a different track, and I started making art that was a little bit more dynamic than the kind of stuff you see in the old textbooks. So for instance, I started making drawings while I was driving around on the freeways. And then that seemed a little dangerous, so I got people to drive me around while I'm strapped to the roof of a car. And it's important to wear goggles because paint seems to go all over the place when you're driving at like 100 kilometers an hour. And then driving down the Trans-Canada on a speedboat going around Burrard Inlet, and then making gigantic paintings based on the drawings. And then taking a Via Rail from Vancouver all the way to Halifax and making drawings. Going up to Dawson City and sitting in a dog sleigh and making drawings of the dogs and the landscape. And so when you're doing projects like this, you keep thinking, like, what is the next step? Like, what's the end game strategy for all of this? And a couple of things that have kind of been in the back of my mind through all of this is Edvard Munch, the guy who painted The Scream, right? He had this outdoor studio he'd like to paint in the middle of the winter. And this is Henri Matisse. His son would drive him around and he'd make some paintings, but he found it was too difficult because cars in that time didn't have shock absorbers, so it was a little rough. So what is the 4D or 3D chess version of what those guys did? So 10 years ago, I had this dream. Like literally while I was sleeping, I had a dream, and when I woke up, I started writing about this dream, and I made a little illustration. And you'll see I like making lots of little illustrations and using Photoshop to make collages. So this dream of somebody standing, myself, hopefully, standing on the moon and making a painting. And it was kind of a silly thing. And then I started thinking about it. The more and more I started thinking about it, the more absurd it seemed, like no one had actually done this, or that this idea was silly. So here's one of these illustrations. This is kind of how I make a lot of my drawings. I take these photographs of my friends and myself, collage them together. So this is me as an artist talking to some guy who's saying, it's a waste of time, it's a waste of money, it's wasting a seat that somebody else could be using that would actually be doing something productive. And it's also potentially putting somebody else's life in danger. If a stupid artist makes some stupid mistake and then somebody else has to go in and rescue them, it screws everything up. Or the thing I've often heard a lot about is this is a joke, right? That you can't possibly be serious. So just a couple quick things. I'm going to run through some details of the moon. So as you know, there's very little gravity on the moon, of course. And this has a number of, I think, very interesting implications, which I'll get to shortly. A day on the moon is equivalent to 13 and a half days on Earth. There's obviously no significant atmosphere, and that means that things get very cold at night and very warm in the daytime. Like a cup of water would literally be boiling in the middle of the day. And there's craters at the North Pole of the moon that have some of the coldest temperatures in the entire solar system. In fact, it rivals some of the coldest places on Pluto, which is just kind of mind-boggling that this thing that is so close to the sun is so cold. And there's also 590 billion kilograms of water or frozen water on the moon as well. So why should an artist go to the moon? And I think there's sort of two ways that we can think about this. There's obviously the practical reasons, the measurable reasons, and there's also the anecdotal, the immeasurable stuff, the cultural impact. So let's go through some of the practical reasons why somebody would go to the moon and what it could do to help society, et cetera. So obviously, if you're going to do anything in space, you have to develop certain kinds of equipment, and that's going to create different kinds of innovations that can be useful besides making art. I'm actually super interested in how weightlessness will affect creativity and so-called right brain thinking. When the people were on the moon originally back in the 60s and early 70s, they were unable to determine pitch because the gravity was so low. So when they were driving those little dune buggies around on the moon, they were going at times almost like 45-degree angles up on these craters, and they were unable to tell that they were going 45 degrees up on this hill and possibly could have even tipped over. And there's also sort of funny videos of them tripping and falling all over themselves. Another thing I think about, obviously you'd have to develop new kinds of paints and materials that would be able to dry in outer space. And this has implications beyond simply just making art, but obviously when we go up there, we want to be able to build new things in space, and they have to be able to weather these extreme conditions. And up until now, we've been taking things and we build them here, and then we assemble them in space. But ultimately, we want to be able to take raw materials and build new things from those materials on other planets, right? And eventually, we want to paint those and coat them with different kinds of materials. Like virtually everything around us has been painted or coated or sprayed with some kind of material to protect it from various different kinds of things. And then possibly there's other, again, pigments that we can use to make new colors, but also maybe new energies, et cetera. So if this sounds kind of interesting, I'm really interested in to collaborate with any other researchers or scientists or chemists or botanists, besides just myself. A couple of interesting books, if you're interested in any of this. Here's, I love this book, Packing to Mars. Has anybody read that book? Nobody? Okay, it's really interesting. It's all about, really it's about what makes Earth special and why Earth is such a habitable place and why space is so inhabitable. There's a whole chapter about how difficult it is to take a dump in space. Chris Hadfield, there's a really great quote in here about why artists should go to space, and I wasn't able to find it, but it's in the original book. And then if you're also thinking like, what does paint and color, how does it apply to my life? This is something totally separate from my life. This is a great book by Victoria Finlay that she went around and kind of explored the history of all these different colors and how they affect us today. But I'll get back to my list. Okay, so the cultural, the immeasurable stuff about going to the moon, why that's important, is the art is a language that everyone can understand. And we can use this language to get people, particularly younger people, into space exploration and science, right? And with interest comes money from government and other kinds of funding. So if you're a scientist, collaborating with an artist is also another way to help you get more funding, because we can help visualize your ideas and your research. It's also a declaration of the priorities of a government or a culture and a people. And it's a very powerful, motivating tool. You think we went to the moon, or the Americans went to the moon in the 60s for reasons beyond simply just going to the moon, right? There was all sorts of symbolic implications about that. And so there's this also idea there's a greater purpose to life and greater meaning, and that each one of us has a role to play except for this very small number of people who can go there. And it demonstrates that life is not all about working and eating, right? It's also about doing things that aren't necessary, right? All the extra pleasures in life, and how depressing it would be if we didn't have those things. And also to inspire other people to follow their own dreams. So how does an artist get to the moon? Well, what I did, or what I'm doing, is I sat down and started making a list. What are all the different kinds of things that I need to do in order to get there? And one of which was to apply to the Canadian Forces Artist Program, also known as the War Artist Program. And I applied, and I got in. And this is a super prestigious thing. I'm super honored to be a part of it, because most of all the greatest Canadian painters and artists have participated in this program. If you've heard of the Group of Seven, they were war artists, and they went to World War I and World War II and were making paintings of the battlefield. So in 2012, I had an opportunity to go up to the North Pole with the Royal Canadian Air Force. And maybe I'm going to skip over a few of these things, because my wife is saying, why do you want to show them a video of the inside of a plane when you're talking about going to the North Pole? But essentially, there was one window, and you fly straight up for about 10 hours, and this is all you see. Mountains after mountains after mountains. This is the giant Globemaster plane we took. I spent a lot of time there hanging out with the Environment Canada scientists. Is anybody Environment Canada here? No? What was really cool about hanging out with them is that they had this little tiny shack way off the base, way further than anyone else could go to. And I got to go there with them many, many times, because they would want to do experiments out there that aren't affected by all the airplanes and stuff that the military is doing. So I made paintings at the North Pole. And I made 100 of these, a little bit bigger than postcard-sized paintings, each one in about 15 minutes, because it's really cold at the North Pole. And I want to transition really quickly to talk about this guy. This is astronaut Alan Bean, who actually went to the moon. And after he retired in his mid-60s, he started making paintings. And he said, basically, the moon was gray, so in order to make my paintings better, I kind of had to figure a way to invent some colors to make them look more interesting. And while I've never been to the moon yet, I respectfully disagree, because that's the same thing that people said to me before I went to the North Pole. They said, you got to bring lots of white. There's not a lot to see up there. And when I was there, it was so incredibly beautiful, so incredibly colorful. We went on these snowmobiles riding around the ice shards, not glaciers, but ice shards. And every day they change. And I thought of it like, it's like a forest, as if every day you walked through the forest and the trees got up and they moved to different places. That's what being at the North Pole is like. Every day it's changing. It's a super dynamic landscape. So people think it's this super boring, ugly, plain space. It is literally the exact opposite of that. And that's what I expect going to the moon would be like. I think I'm going to skip over this, but basically, I had an opportunity to go in a CF-18 Hornet and make art at the speed of sound. And this video's on my website. You can find all this stuff. So I got to fly around in this CF-18 Hornet with a couple of different pilots. I'm in the backseat. I actually got to fly it and do some loop-de-loops and literally break the sound barrier while I was making drawings. And I took those drawings. I made 100 of these small little drawings in about an hour and a half flight that they organized purely for my purposes. There was other plane that they were flying around so I could observe it. And then I took them and I made these gigantic paintings. I made 5 of these. They're bigger than the screen right now. And then I went to the Kamloops Art Gallery, and while I was there, I was building this sculpture, and I had a lot of little kids come and help me every day. And the idea that I wanted to do was to create basically a flight simulator that their families could come and sit inside of and be surrounded by these gigantic paintings. A lot of people would say like, oh man, I can't spend too long in there. It's really disorienting. I was like, yes, that's exactly the experience of being in a fighter plane. And so if you come and see my art and then you feel ill and you throw up afterwards, that's actually a really great thing. And so there was a film that this director, Mike Peterson, made about this whole experience. It was a very amazing piece of work. And so then I've gone around and I've talked about going to the moon to lots of little kids. And at the very end, I show this image of somebody standing on the moon making a painting. And I get a lot of those same reactions that you hear at the very end. But 2 months ago, I was actually on an airplane, and I got off the airplane, and I had like 100 text messages from people all over saying, oh my God, like you got to get a hold of this guy. Like, what's going on? Like, people are talking about this very thing that you've been talking about for the past 10 years. Right? So a couple of months ago, Elon Musk and Yusaku Maezawa, this Japanese billionaire who kind of started the Amazon of Japan, this idea to take one of the SpaceX shuttles and fly around the moon. And the idea that Maezawa had was to use that as an opportunity to take 8 different artists along with him. And this idea that he would be able to have that experience with artists who would be able to give a different perspective to this thing that has, people have already been to the moon. So what are we going to do next? What is the 3D chess version of what we've already done?
So how are you planning on reaching out to the SpaceX team and sort of putting your pitch forward?
Well, I would love if people tweet out about it, use the hashtag paint on the moon or Markowsky to the moon. And I also want to use this as an opportunity to encourage other people to think about their own dreams and express their dreams. We sort of just leave that to the realm of children, but I think as adults, we abandon those dreams, and I want to encourage every Canadian watching me right now to think about their dreams and to shout out their dreams. And just like I have like the most ridiculous dream in the world, but people are now coming around to the possibility. Musk and Maezawa, they are visionaries. They've seen that space travel is a possibility for everybody, and to bring artists around to help document that experience so that we can share it with the billions of other people who may not be able to go there, I think is a gift they're giving to the world.
Well, putting an artist into space, not so out there after all.
But essentially, this idea of going to the moon and making art is no longer this ridiculous fantasy that I had, this thing that was my dream alone. This thing has now become a larger dream that people all around the world are talking about. And now I'm not such a crazy person after all, right? So coming back to this idea, you know, if you have a dream, you can do it. And my dream is to go to outer space and stand on the surface of the moon and make a painting. Thank you very much.
Michael Markowsky, everyone. Thank you so much, Michael. That was actually really inspiring.